A dear friend of mine introduced me to someone recently, and I'm really looking forward to introducing her to you. Signe Elisabeth Åsberg, and I'm going to have her say her own name so that you can hear it the way it's supposed to be said, but that's my best attempt at it, is joining us today. Signe is a molecular biologist for the Norwegian University of Science and Technology, NTNU. She is a research advisor there, and she got passionate several years ago in working with sepsis and trying to intervene on that particular aspect of safety-related medicine. She is even starting a new organization called Sepsis Research, and I think she's going to say that word also for us. Signe, welcome, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So do say your name and your affiliation so that people can hear it in the way that you would say it, not in my terrible attempt at saying it from my English.
Oh, that's fine. My name is Signe Elisabeth Åsberg. I'm starting an organization for sepsis in Norway called Sepsis Research.
Thank you. And tell us a little bit, I should say that you are based out of Norway, Oslo, if I remember correctly.
In Trondheim.
Ah, thank you. Thank you for correcting me. Tell us a little bit about why it is that sepsis, and if you would, give us a brief view of what sepsis is for those who may not know. What had you become interested in sepsis, and what is it for the person who doesn't know?
Sure. So sepsis happens when you have an infection and your immune system overreacts to that infection. And normally the immune system is very good at dealing with infections. But when it overreacts, it starts hurting the body as well. And this very large and escalating immune reaction ends up damaging your organs. And if you don't get help, it becomes very dangerous very fast. Mm-hmm. So I have been interested in how microorganisms interact with the environment they are in for many, many years. During my PhD, I got a chance to study what happens during an infection when we treat with antibiotics. And I also got very passionate about global health and about taking molecular biology a step further and trying to see what we find out, how can we actually make a difference in the world today and not waiting for like the research to have an impact maybe 10 or 20 years from now. And what I found when I started looking into how infections affect society, I find that all infections can cause sepsis. And so it sort of brought all infections together in one large problem. And it's a problem that's very prevalent in all countries. And it's difficult to diagnose, it's difficult to treat, and it's difficult for us to take care of the survivors. So there was so much to do, and it seemed so important. I got very, very passionate about it.
I know here in the United States, and I believe this to be true in many nations, it's prevalent, it's very high risk. People can die, and unfortunately too many people do die from it. It also can turn violent to the body very, very quickly. You can think that things are kind of going okay, and then suddenly it's too far to work out. It can really, I know people who have lost limbs. I know people who have lost children. I know people who have lost their parents and loved ones. And so I know how important this issue is globally. You and I were talking just before we decided to record this interview today about the correlation of sepsis and COVID-19. Tell us a little bit about how you see those two correlating with one another in these sort of current times.
Sure. So, like I said, any pathogen or any microorganism can cause sepsis, and COVID is not different. And the well-known, what do you say? The well-known problem with COVID is that it causes ARDS, the acute respiratory distress syndrome, and this is very similar to sepsis. You can almost say it's just a different name for sepsis, or sepsis located to the lungs. So the ARDS, that is the big complication from COVID, that also is what many people die from, is so similar to sepsis that the symptoms are the same. And the difficulty in catching it on time is also very similar. Secondly, people who have COVID-19, they are at higher risk of other infections after they get home from the hospital. Because they've had a very serious lung infection, there is an increased risk they might have a secondary pneumonia from bacterial pathogens. Mm-hmm. So that also means they are at increased risk of pneumonia and of sepsis later on. And thirdly, people who have been to the intensive care unit, they often struggle when they get back home. So there's something called intensive care unit post syndrome, so that you might struggle long term after you've been in the ICU. And it's partly because you've been through a very serious disease, and it's partly because of the treatment you got is also very hard and difficult for the body. So there are a lot of similarities between COVID-19 and sepsis.
So let's look at it through your lens as a molecular biologist and a researcher. You probably work on behalf of clinicians who are seeing patients come in. Maybe they're coming in for one reason, but because of their long stay in ICU or their prolonged illness for some other reason, they begin to develop sepsis as a comorbidity, if you will. I believe that's the correct term, and feel free to correct me because I'm definitely not a clinician. What is it that you as a researcher are able to do to help things go more smoothly for clinicians? And what would you recommend both clinicians and lay people like myself know in order to mitigate the serious consequences that can come from developing sepsis?
So as researchers, one way I think it's important that we work very closely with clinicians is that we can have that dialogue about what is it that they need, how is it that we can help them, where is it that we need more knowledge in our research. For instance, in early diagnostics of sepsis, especially with when the sepsis is caused by bacterial pathogens. It's not enough to know only the species of the bacteria. You also want to know if they are resistant to antibiotics. So actually working closely with clinicians and having that day-to-day conversation is so valuable in determining what questions do we need to answer first, and what kind of knowledge is it that we need to generate to help them.
That makes sense to me. And then to the second question, what do you recommend people look for? If I'm a person going into the hospital, I'm working closely with my clinician, what is my clinician going to be looking out for, and what signs can I be looking out for that I might think, oh, I wonder if this could be sepsis?
So to recognize sepsis, there are some, you need to think that a person might have an infection. So you suspect infection in the first place, either in yourself or in people you are around. And then there are some keywords especially if they like have a high fever, although some people don't develop fever from sepsis. They might have slurred speech or confusion, and they might be pain. And the very important key thing to watch out for is when people start being mentally affected. So if you suspect infection and the person is confused or behave in a strange way, that is a very clear warning sign to definitely look out for. And a lot of the patients, they actually say when they look back on the episode, they will say, I felt like I was going to die. And it's such, I mean, that's the key word that keeps on repeating. It's so important to know that infections can have like a mental effect on our mental state. Then in children, it's a lot harder to know or to recognize. But some kids develop almost, it looks like a kind of rash when the blood starts clotting. You see it on the skin is mottled, or it looks like there's a rash. And also kids might stop producing urine. But I will say it's a lot harder to diagnose in kids.
I see. Let's switch our focus just a moment. Signe, tell us a little bit about the organization that you're founding. What will your organization do? What is its purpose?
So our first and foremost purpose is to help and educate everyone about sepsis. Mm-hmm. So when I tell people that I work with sepsis, a lot of them will say, oh, is that the same as blood poisoning? So I want everyone to know what sepsis is and to know the warning signs of sepsis and to know when they should seek medical care. I also want everyone to know that people who have had sepsis or has had a serious infection, they might take a long time to recover. And it might take years. So I want the society to know that a person might come out from serious infection and do not have a diagnosis that says like this person will have long-term struggles. But I want everyone to know that that might still be the case. So that's our main goal. Second, I want the organization to help bridge the silos between clinicians and scientists and the public and the private sector. Because I believe there is a lot of progress that we can make with the tools that we have today. But it's a matter of getting people in the same room and talking together and sharing their knowledge.
Thank you. I really am grateful for you doing that work. Are you doing this organization specifically in your community, or are you imagining this to be a broader effort?
I'm imagining it to be at least a national effort. And then I hope we'll get to work with European and global sepsis organizations as we go along.
Good. Signe, I'm going to ask you to just, please send me any links that you want me to put into the description of this interview, which will be posted on YouTube, as you know. And I hope that people will, after listening to Signe today, understand that sepsis can be a very, very serious infectious event. And it can be a side or a complication of care for other reasons. So you might go into the hospital for one reason, but develop sepsis while getting care for that. And even clinicians have a learning curve about what we know about sepsis today. Researchers like Signe are studying this in the labs and bringing their research to the forefront, not just for other researchers, for expedient applications to help address sepsis when it does occur, but to also look for those and educate about the early signs. Signe, thank you so much for being on this interview today. I'm really glad that people can hear a little bit more about this terrible disease that you're working on along with your peers. And I wish you the absolute very, very best. I know too many families who have had terrible suffering and fatalities from sepsis. So it's important work that you're doing. Thank you for taking this time.
Thank you so much for having me.
Have a good day, and thank you for listening. If you have comments about this interview or any of the interviews that we're doing while I'm taking the zigzag for zero from Southern California to Capitol Hill, leave them in the comment section and I will be in touch with you. Take good care.